The human mind has a peculiar feature that almost everyone overlooks. When you sit down to study something difficult, a chapter of physics, a mathematical proof, a complex idea, your brain operates in one of two fundamentally different modes. The mode you're in determines whether you truly understand or merely memorize. And here's what matters. You can switch between these modes deliberately in about 60 seconds. Let's start with something you probably recognize. You're reading a textbook, following along, nodding at each sentence. Everything seems to make sense as your eyes move across the page. You reach the end of the chapter, close the book, and suddenly realize you can't explain what you just read. The words went in, but nothing stuck. This happens to students everywhere, every day, and they blame themselves. I'm not smart enough. I don't have a mind for this subject. Some people just get it, and I don't. But this has nothing to do with intelligence. It has everything to do with which mode your brain was operating in. Here's the distinction that changes everything. Your brain can either receive information passively, or it can actively wrestle with it. When you read that textbook and things seem clear, you're in receiving mode. Information flows past your eyes, registers as familiar patterns, creates a temporary sense of understanding. This mode feels comfortable, even pleasant. No strain, no confusion, everything smooth. But this smoothness is deceptive. You're not building real understanding, you're building an illusion of understanding. The second mode, the active mode, feels completely different. It's uncomfortable. When you engage this mode, you stop following along and start questioning. You pause after a sentence and ask yourself, can you explain this concept without looking at the page? Could you teach this to someone else? What would happen if you changed one variable in this equation? Why does this principle work this way and not another? This mode creates mental friction. Your brain has to work. And that work, that strain you feel, that's exactly what builds genuine understanding. The remarkable thing is this: most people never deliberately choose which mode they're in. They default to passive receiving because it's easier, because it feels like progress, because turning pages and highlighting sentences creates a satisfying sense of productivity. Then they wonder why nothing stays with them, why they can't apply what they've learned, why exam day brings panic instead of confidence. So here's the 60-second switch that activates the deeper mode. Close whatever you're studying. Look away from the page. Now, explain out loud what you just read, not in the book's words, but in your own language. Pretend you're teaching it to someone who knows nothing about the subject. Speak it aloud, actual words in actual sentences, not vague thoughts in your head. Within seconds, something happens. You discover gaps. Concepts that seemed crystal clear a moment ago now feel fuzzy. Connections you thought you understood fall apart when you try to articulate them. Words fail you. You stumble. You realize you can't actually explain this thing you thought you knew. This moment of confusion, this is not failure. This is the activation point. This is where real learning begins. The brain has a peculiar characteristic. It cannot distinguish between familiarity and understanding. When you read something, your brain recognizes patterns, connects to existing knowledge, and signals, yes, this makes sense. But recognition isn't the same as comprehension. Think about how you can recognize a friend's face instantly without being able to describe or draw it accurately. Recognition is automatic, surface level. Understanding requires something deeper. When you force yourself to explain something without the source material in front of you, you move from recognition to reconstruction. Your brain must retrieve the concept, organize it into coherent structure, translate it into language, and present it logically. Every gap in your understanding becomes immediately obvious. You can't fake it. You can't gloss over the parts you don't quite grasp. The explanation either works or it doesn't. This process does something fascinating. It exposes the difference between what you think you know and what you actually know. And that difference is where growth happens. Every gap you discover is a precise target for further study. Instead of rereading entire chapters, hoping something will stick better the second time, you now know exactly which specific concepts need more attention. But here's where it gets more interesting. The act of attempting to explain something, even when you struggle, even when you fail, strengthens your understanding far more than passive review ever could. The brain remembers what it works to retrieve. When you force yourself to reconstruct an idea from memory, you're not just testing your knowledge, you're actively reinforcing the neural pathways that encode that knowledge. Think about what happens physically when you try to recall something. Your brain searches through its networks, making connections, activating related concepts, constructing bridges between ideas. Every failed attempt, every moment of struggle, every wait, how does this work again, strengthens those pathways. The difficulty isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. The harder your brain works to retrieve and reconstruct information, the more permanently that information embeds itself. This explains something that puzzles many students. Why cramming the night before an exam produces such fragile knowledge. When you frantically review material hours before a test, everything feels familiar. You recognize concepts, nod along, tell yourself, yes, I know this. But you haven't forced your brain to actively retrieve and reconstruct anything. You've created recognition without understanding. The moment the exam presents that knowledge in a slightly different context or asks you to apply it in an unexpected way, the whole structure collapses. You knew it last night. Why can't you remember it now? Because you never actually knew it. You recognized it. Contrast this with someone who regularly practices active recall. They close the book and explain concepts aloud. They struggle, discover gaps, go back and study those specific points, then try explaining again. They repeat this cycle. By exam day, they've reconstructed those ideas dozens of times. The knowledge isn't sitting on the surface as fragile recognition. It's embedded deep as robust understanding. When the exam throws unexpected questions, their brain has practiced manipulating these concepts in multiple ways. They can adapt, apply, extend what they know. Now, let's go deeper into the mechanism. Why does speaking the explanation out loud matter so much? Why not just think through it silently? The answer lies in how language forces precision. When you explain something in your head, your thoughts can remain vague and impressionistic. You can wave your mental hand at fuzzy concepts and tell yourself, yeah, basically that, without really articulating anything concrete. But when you speak aloud, you must form complete sentences. You must choose specific words. You must organize ideas into sequential order. This requirement for precision exposes every crack in your understanding. Try this experiment. Take something you think you understand well, a process you perform regularly, a principle from your field, a skill you're confident in. Now explain it aloud as if teaching a complete beginner. Don't just describe what to do. Explain why it works this way. Explain what would happen if you changed one step. Explain the underlying principle. You'll likely find yourself saying, more than you expected. Pausing to find the right words. Backtracking because your first explanation wasn't quite right. Realizing you're using jargon without explaining what it means. Discovering that your understanding was actually a collection of memorized procedures without deep comprehension of the principles underneath. This is valuable information. These struggles show you exactly where your understanding is superficial, and now you know precisely what to investigate further. Here's another layer. Explaining aloud also reveals logical gaps and contradictions that silent review misses. When you read a textbook, your brain automatically fills in missing steps. It papers over logical leaps. It connects dots that aren't actually connected on the page, drawing from your existing knowledge to make things seem more coherent than they are. But when you speak an explanation, you must make every step explicit. If there's a logical gap, you stumble over it. If two ideas contradict each other, the contradiction becomes obvious when you try to state both clearly. This is why the best students don't just study, they teach. Even if they're teaching an imaginary audience, even if they're explaining to an empty room, the act of teaching forces a level of understanding that passive study never reaches. Teachers know this phenomenon well. You never truly master a subject until you've taught it. Not because teaching adds new information, but because teaching demands that you reconstruct the entire logical structure from foundations to conclusions, exposing every weak spot in your grasp. Let's talk about application, because understanding the principle isn't enough. You need to see how to use it practically. Suppose you're studying thermodynamics. You've just read a section about entropy. It made sense while reading. Now close the book. Explain entropy to an imaginary student who's never heard the term. Use simple language. Give examples. Explain why it matters. If you're like most people on their first attempt, you'll stammer something about disorder and energy spreading out, and then peter out. You might remember the formal definition you read 10 minutes ago, but can you explain what it actually means? Can you give a concrete example? Can you say why this concept is important enough to have its own word? Go back to the book. Find exactly what you couldn't explain. Read that section again, but this time actively. Ask questions as you read. When it says entropy increases, ask yourself, increases compared to what? What exactly is measuring this increase? Why does it always increase what would happen if it decreased? What prevents it from decreasing? Now close the book again. Explain again. You'll do better this time, but you'll still find gaps. Good. Those gaps are your curriculum. They tell you precisely where to focus. Repeat this cycle. Each time through, your explanation gets clearer, more precise, more comprehensive. You're not just memorizing the textbook's words, you're building your own understanding from the ground up. By the 10th iteration, you can explain entropy clearly, give multiple examples, answer questions about edge cases, and connect it to other thermodynamic principles. This is real mastery, not the illusion of understanding that comes from nodding along while reading. Or consider mathematics. You've worked through a proof, following each step. It all checks out. Now, close your notebook. Reproduce the proof from memory, not the mechanical steps, the logical flow. Why does this step follow from the previous one? What makes this approach work? What would happen if you tried a different method? You'll quickly discover which parts you genuinely understood versus which parts you simply accepted because they were written in front of you. Maybe you followed the algebraic manipulations but don't really grasp why this particular technique was chosen. Maybe you understood each individual step but can't see the overall strategy. These revelations are gold. They transform vague, "I should probably review this," into specific, "I need to understand why we factor this expression here." The same principle applies to any field. Reading history, close the book and explain the causes of a war without looking at the text. Studying biology, describe how photosynthesis works as if teaching a classroom. Learning a language, explain a grammatical rule in your own words. Every field, every subject, every concept can be approached this way. Here's what happens when you make this your standard practice. Studying becomes efficient. Instead of spending hours rereading textbooks, hoping something will stick, you spend minutes identifying exactly what needs more work. Instead of generic anxiety about not getting it, you develop a precise map of your knowledge gaps. Instead of passive consumption that creates illusory progress, you engage in active construction that builds real understanding. And there's something deeper happening too. This practice develops a particular relationship with knowledge. You stop seeing learning as absorption information flowing from books into your brain and start seeing it as construction. You're not a vessel being filled. You're a builder assembling understanding piece by piece, testing each connection, ensuring everything fits together properly. This shift in perspective changes everything. When something doesn't make sense, you don't blame yourself for being stupid. You recognize it as a signal. There's a piece missing from your construction, a connection that needs strengthening, a principle that requires deeper investigation. Confusion becomes useful feedback rather than a source of frustration. You also develop what might be called intellectual honesty. You can no longer fool yourself about what you know. The moment you try to explain something and stumble, you face the truth. You don't actually understand this yet. This can be uncomfortable at first. It's easier to maintain the pleasant illusion that reading equals knowing. But this honesty is liberating. You stop wasting time on material you've already mastered. You stop feeling guilty about things you haven't mastered because you know exactly what needs work and you're working on it systematically. There's practical wisdom here that extends beyond academic subjects. This same principle applies to any skill, any knowledge, any understanding you want to develop. Want to truly understand how your car engine works? Read about it, then explain it aloud without notes. Want to master a recipe? Cook it once following instructions. Then explain the process and the principles behind each step without looking at the recipe. Want to understand a political position you disagree with? Study it, then explain the reasoning behind it as persuasively as possible without referring to your sources. The method is universal because it's based on how the brain actually works, not on tricks or shortcuts. You're not hacking your mind, you're using it properly. You're engaging the mechanism that evolution designed for deep learning, active retrieval and reconstruction. And here's the beautiful part. This 60-second practice closing the material and explaining aloud costs you almost nothing in time but multiplies the value of every minute you spend studying. 1 hour of active recall beats 5 hours of passive rereading. You learn more, retain longer, understand deeper, all while spending less total time studying. The brain is not a tape recorder that stores information exactly as received. It's a dynamic system that strengthens whatever it actively uses. Every time you force your brain to retrieve and reconstruct knowledge, you're telling it, this matters, keep this accessible, maintain these pathways. Every time you passively reread without testing yourself, you're telling your brain, this is just noise, no need to prioritize it. So the question isn't whether you have time to practice active recall. The question is whether you can afford not to. Every hour spent in passive study mode is an hour that produces minimal lasting value. Every minute spent in active retrieval mode is a minute that produces exponential returns. The path forward is simple. The next time you sit down to study anything, a chapter, an article, a set of notes, make this commitment. After every page, every section, every concept, close the material and explain it aloud. Struggle through the gaps. Identify what's missing. Go back and focus on exactly those gaps. Repeat, do this consistently, and something remarkable happens. Your relationship with learning transforms. Understanding becomes tangible rather than mysterious. Progress becomes measurable rather than vague. Confidence replaces anxiety because you know exactly what you know and what you don't. The brain wants to understand deeply. It's built for it. But it needs you to engage the right mode, the active, wrestling, reconstructing mode. That mode is always available, always just 60 seconds away. Close the book, speak the idea. Face the gaps honestly, fill them precisely. This is how genuine understanding is built, piece by piece, concept by concept, explanation by explanation.